We welcome you back to this channel. In this video, we explore paranormal encounters in haunted libraries. Discover what happens when books aren't the only things that come to life in the midst of silence. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The West Wing.
Since I was a child, the town library had been my refuge. That old, dusty building was in a somewhat secluded part of town, but I always enjoyed walking there. Inside, its narrow hallways and shelves crammed with ancient books had always been, for me, a place where I could escape the noise of the world. I spent a lot of time reading in that library as a kid. Now, in my 30s, I still visited frequently, always looking for a quiet corner to read. The library had something that drew me in, something hard to describe. Maybe it was the sepulchral silence or the feeling that time stopped inside. However, something had changed recently, and the atmosphere felt different. I often noticed that the few visitors avoided certain sections, especially the West Wing. It was a forgotten corner, filled with books whose pages crumbled to the touch, and with a smell of dampness so intense it was almost suffocating. Rumors said the library was haunted, but I always dismissed them as mere gossip. Until that night. I was alone in the West Wing, leafing through a book of Gothic tales, when I felt something watching me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but that sensation grew more intense, like a cold, dense presence had settled behind me. I looked up, and there, among the shadows cast by the shelves, I saw it. It was a tall, thin figure, impossibly dark. It had no face. Its skin was ashen, with cracks spreading across its body. Its eyes were full of malice, and it felt like it could harm just with its gaze. My body froze. The figure moved slowly, without making a sound, as if it were floating. It was as if its presence drained my energy, and the more I looked at it, the more I felt an inexplicable emptiness taking over me. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't respond. Fear anchored me to the ground. The entity didn't move in a straight line, but instead weaved through the shelves, as if deciding whether to come closer. I could feel its hatred. It wasn't just a spectral presence, it was something evil. Without warning, the entity stopped and raised a bony arm that extended too far, as if it had no real joints. The skin on its hand stretched and twisted, revealing elongated fingers ending in sharp tips. It pointed at me, and in a whisper that echoed in my head without passing through my ears, I heard an unintelligible murmur. A deep sound that seemed like a mix of wails and growls. It was as if it was trying to communicate something, but not with human words. A sharp pain seized my head, and I felt as if my mind was being pulled into a dark, bottomless pit. In my desperation, I managed to step back a few paces, stumbling over a pile of books that fell to the floor, breaking the heavy silence. The entity vanished in a blink, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it. But the room remained saturated with a malignant energy. I knew I hadn't truly escaped. Something of that figure lingered there, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, but the feeling of emptiness and terror it left behind was too real. Each time I returned to the library, I felt its presence closer, stronger. I did everything I could to avoid being alone in the library, especially at dusk. I began avoiding the West Wing entirely, but the figure appeared in my dreams, dragging me back to that dark corner. The books that once seemed like safe havens were now silent threats, portals to a horror I couldn't understand. Sometimes, passing by the library at night, I saw shadows that didn't belong to any person, moving behind the dusty windows. I've wanted to warn others, but I can't prove what I saw, and I don't want people to think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. Something evil lurks among those books, something without shape or name, that feeds on the fear and despair of those who venture too far. Eventually, I stopped visiting the library, but I know that thing is still there. In the silence of the night, when everything becomes oppressively still, I can still feel its empty gaze on me, no matter where I am. That presence has stayed with me since the first time I saw it, and I haven't been able to escape it.
The child in the basement.
I remember it all began when I took a temporary job at the oldest library in my city, an imposing building with dark bricks and Gothic windows that had always had a sinister reputation. I had read about its history. It was built in the early 19th century and had witnessed fires, inexplicable closures, and some disappearances of people that, although never proven, remained in the collective memory as silent warnings. My job was simple: to organize old books in the historical archives section, a dark and dusty corner in the basement, where sunlight barely reached. There was something uncomfortable about that place from the first day. Every time I went down the stairs, I felt a strange chill, as if the air became dense and oppressive. The shelves loomed like giant shadows, and the old books emitted a musty smell. Most of the employees avoided going down there, and some told me it was because their cell phone signals were completely lost, but I always suspected there was something more. One afternoon, while sorting through a collection of old newspapers, I heard a murmur. It was barely perceptible, like a distant whisper filtering through the shelves. I thought it might be the noise of the building, or perhaps the echo of someone on the upper floors, so I didn't pay much attention to it. However, the murmur continued and grew clearer as the minutes passed. It sounded like the voice of a child. I searched the entire room hoping to find an intruder, but there was no one, until I saw him. A small boy about 7 or 8 years old, wearing old, worn clothes, standing at the end of a hallway of shelves. His hair was dark and messy, and his eyes showed no expression. He just stared at me. I stood still, unable to look away. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just remained there. I took a step towards him, but before I could get closer, the boy turned and vanished behind one of the shelves. I didn't hear his footsteps. There was no sound, just a silence that invaded the place. After that day, I began to see the boy more frequently. He appeared in different places, watching me. Once I saw him sitting at one of the tables, his head bowed as if he was crying. But when I tried to approach, he vanished again. He wasn't a mischievous or playful child, but rather a sad and lonely figure, trapped in that place. Books began to fall off the shelves for no reason, always when I passed by. The lights flickered and sometimes went out completely, leaving me alone in the dark for what felt like hours. Once, while I was reviewing some documents, I felt a cold hand touch my back. I turned around immediately, but there was no one there. One night, I stayed late because I had fallen behind with the inventory. The library was already closed, and everyone had left. As I was finishing up, I heard that murmur again, but this time it was clearer, as if it was coming from right behind me. When I finally turned around, I saw him standing just a few meters away. But this time, something was different. The boy was holding a small, very old book in his hands, with a worn and almost illegible cover. He opened it slowly, and although I couldn't see what was written, the atmosphere grew heavier. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. That's when the boy looked up, and his eyes, empty and dark, began to fill with tears that ran down his cheeks. Suddenly, a sharp pain invaded me. Everything around me started to blur, and the whispers turned into screams. I felt myself fading as I watched the boy walk away down the basement aisles. The next day, they found me unconscious on the basement floor. They took me to the hospital, but they couldn't find anything physical that would explain what had happened to me. I never went back to the library. I quit the job feeling unable to return to that place. There are still moments when I can hear that murmur, and the feeling of being watched never really left. It's still with me. I never stopped thinking about that boy. Part of me wants to know his story, but on the other hand, I want to stay as far away as possible from the memory of that time in the library.
The warning.
I was 26 when I started working at the town library. The building was an imposing structure from the early 20th century, with enormous windows that let in the diffused light of the sunset, giving it an air of majesty. Inside, the shelves were so tall, they required ladders to reach the oldest volumes. I always loved being surrounded by books, so I felt this would be my ideal job. However, from the first day, I noticed a heavy atmosphere in the place, but I attributed it to the solemn silence and dark atmosphere typical of old libraries. The second floor, where the oldest books were kept, always caught my attention, although I was warned not to go up there unless it was strictly necessary. The floor was unused, the wooden boards creaked underfoot, and the light barely filtered through the dirty and opaque stained glass windows. One night, when the clock was almost striking 9 and I was getting ready to close up, I heard a soft noise, like a whisper. I thought someone had stayed behind, so I went up to take a look. That was when I saw her for the first time. It was a woman. She was wearing a long, old-fashioned white dress. Her long, dark hair covered part of her face. I froze, unable to speak, as she stood with her back to me, facing one of the windows on the second floor, her figure barely illuminated by the light from a street lamp outside. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, maybe caused by fatigue. However, that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about that woman, or get her image out of my head. The next day, I returned to work, determined to forget what had happened, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Books would fall from the shelves for no apparent reason. The lights flickered erratically, and I constantly felt a presence behind me, although when I turned around, no one was there. As the days passed, the apparitions became more frequent and disturbing. Sometimes I would see her out of the corner of my eye, peeking out between the shelves, but never fully revealing her face. Other times, I would hear unintelligible whispers, barely audible, filling the air like a distant lament. Another night, while I was closing the library, the sound of sobbing startled me. It was coming from the second floor, the forbidden area I had been told to avoid. Against all common sense, I went up. When I got there, I saw her again, sitting in one of the chairs, her head down and her hands covering her face. Her crying echoed off the walls, a mix of despair and contained fury. I tried to back away, but the books began to fall from the shelves, hitting the floor with force. She looked up, and this time I saw her face clearly. Her empty eyes, filled with sadness, met mine. I felt a crushing weight on my chest and couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond, and a piercing cold enveloped me. Then she spoke, her voice a choked whisper, almost a moan. "Give it back to me." I didn't understand what she meant, but that phrase repeated over and over, like an endless echo until she vanished. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the place. I asked a coworker, an older woman who had worked there for decades, if she knew anything about what I had seen. She looked at me with a mix of pity and fear before telling me the story of Claire. Years ago, Claire had been the librarian, a young woman who had lost her son in a tragic accident. It was said that, consumed by grief, she took her own life on the second floor of the library. No one dared to go up there since, unless absolutely necessary. With this new information, I understood that her appearances weren't just acts of haunting, but a desperate cry for something lost. That night, I dreamed of her. She was in the library, and Claire was pointing at a specific book, an old and worn one. I woke up sweating and breathless, but the next day I couldn't help but search for the book. When I opened it, a photograph fell to the floor. It was a picture of Claire and her son, both smiling. I felt overwhelmed by a mixture of sadness and fear. I left the photo on the table on the second floor, hoping that somehow this would calm her spirit. I never knew if my action helped her find peace. But since then, every time I closed the library and found myself alone, I felt that Claire was still there, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and longing, waiting for something that would never come.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, Give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.